Sometimes the people we judge by their appearance carry the deepest secrets of all. In a world where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the strength of his back, few bothered to look beyond the surface. Dakota Territory, 1888. Boone Carver stood 6'6" in his weathered boots, splitting firewood outside Millbrook's general store like he had every morning for 3 years. The townsfolk saw only what they expected, a simple ranch hand with muscles like iron and a mind they assumed was just as hard. When Charlotte Whitmore arrived from back east to start the town's first real school, she brought with her fine dresses, proper manners, and books written in languages most folks had never heard spoken. The contrast couldn't have been sharper, the refined lady teacher and the silent giant with an axe. But when Charlotte accidentally dropped her Latin primer that autumn afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Boone Carver opened his mouth and spoke words that would change everything anyone thought they knew about him. What secret had this cowboy been hiding all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Millbrook, Dakota Territory, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Dust motes danced in the crisp October air, carried on a wind that spoke of winter's approaching grip. This was a town built on hope and held together by determination, a collection of wooden buildings and ambitious dreams scattered across the endless prairie. Boone Carver had been splitting wood outside Henderson's general store since before dawn, his massive frame moving with the steady rhythm of a man who understood the value of honest work. Each swing of his axe sent splinters flying, the sharp crack echoing off the buildings like gunshots in the morning quiet. The pile of split logs grew steadily beside him, neat and precisely stacked, the work of someone who took pride in doing things right. At 32, Boone carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen more of the world than most folks in Millbrook could imagine. His dark hair was kept short and tidy, his jaw clean-shaven despite the frontier custom of wearing beards. There was something about his bearing that suggested refinement beneath the rough exterior, though few took the time to notice. The ranch hands respected his strength, the storekeepers appreciated his reliability, and the town's women found themselves stealing glances at his broad shoulders and gentle brown eyes. But respect and appreciation were different things from understanding, and Boone had learned long ago that some truths were better kept buried. He paused in his work as the eastbound stage rounded the corner onto Main Street, its wheels kicking up small clouds of dust. The driver, old Pete Morrison, raised a weathered hand in greeting. Boone nodded back, watching as the stage drew to a halt in front of the hotel. 3 passengers emerged, 2 traveling salesmen and a young woman who immediately commanded attention. Charlotte Whitmore stepped down from the stage with the grace of someone accustomed to society's finer expectations. Her traveling dress was practical yet elegant, a deep blue wool that complemented her auburn hair. She carried herself with confidence, her chin raised just enough to suggest she was unaccustomed to backing down from challenges. Even from a distance, Boone could see intelligence in her green eyes as she surveyed her new surroundings. The leather satchel she clutched contained more than personal belongings. It held her future and the future she hoped to create for this frontier town. Inside were teaching materials, lesson plans, and books that represented everything she believed about the power of education to transform lives. Among them was her prized Latin primer, a well-worn volume that had accompanied her through her own studies at the Boston Female Seminary. Hiram Henderson emerged from his store, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron. As Millbrook's most prominent merchant, he felt obligated to welcome important visitors personally. "Miss Whitmore, I presume? Welcome to Millbrook." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." Charlotte's voice carried the cultivated accent of Eastern refinement, but there was warmth in it too. "I trust my trunk arrived safely on yesterday's freight wagon?" "Indeed it did, miss. Your father's letter explained everything." The whole town's been talking about having our first real schoolmarm. Henderson's tone carried a mixture of pride and uncertainty. Education was a fine thing in principle, but this was practical country, where a person's worth was measured in tangible contributions. Charlotte glanced around the street, taking in the saloon, the blacksmith shop, the general store, where Boone continued his steady work. "And where will I be teaching, Mr. Henderson?" "Well now, that's still being worked out. Your father mentioned in his correspondence that you'd be starting immediately, but the town council hasn't finished discussing the details." Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "There's some who wonder if we really need a formal school when the children are learning plenty, helping with family businesses." The slight stiffening in Charlotte's posture revealed that this wasn't the first time she'd encountered such attitudes. "Education isn't merely about reading and arithmetic, Mr. Henderson. It's about expanding minds and creating opportunities. These children deserve the same chance to better themselves that their Eastern counterparts enjoy." Behind them, Boone's axe paused mid-swing. Something in Charlotte's voice, the passion, the conviction reminded him of another time, another life, when he'd believed just as fervently in the power of knowledge to elevate the human spirit. "Of course, miss. Of course." Henderson glanced nervously toward the saloon, where several prominent townsmen often gathered for their morning coffee and discussion of local affairs. "Perhaps we should get you settled at the boarding house first. Mrs. Patterson has prepared her finest room." Charlotte followed Henderson's gaze and noticed the small crowd beginning to form. Word of her arrival was spreading quickly through the town's informal network of gossip and curiosity. Among the onlookers was Thomas Blackwood, her father's business partner in several cattle ventures, a man whose opinion carried considerable weight in Millbrook's social hierarchy. Blackwood approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being heard. "Miss Whitmore, your father sends his regards. He was delayed in Denver but expects to join us within the week." "Mr. Blackwood." Charlotte extended her gloved hand with practiced courtesy. "I hope my early arrival hasn't caused any inconvenience." "Not at all, not at all. Though I confess there are some practical matters we should discuss regarding your teaching plans." Blackwood's smile was diplomatic, but his eyes held reservations. "The town has functioned quite well without formal schooling. Some worry that too much book learning might give young people ideas above their station." The comment sparked something fierce in Charlotte's eyes. "Ideas above their station, Mr. Blackwood? I would argue that education gives people the tools to create their own stations rather than accepting limitations imposed by others." Boone found himself setting down his axe entirely, drawn by the exchange despite himself. There was steel beneath Charlotte's refined exterior, a determination that reminded him of the reformers he'd known in his former life, people who believed that knowledge and faith could transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Mrs. Patterson appeared from the boarding house, her grey hair neatly pinned and her expression welcoming. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Margaret Patterson. Your room is ready, and I've prepared a hot meal for your journey's end." "You're very kind, Mrs. Patterson." Charlotte gathered her skirts and moved toward the boarding house, but as she passed the general store, her satchel caught on the corner of a wooden crate. The leather clasp snapped open, spilling books and papers onto the dusty street. Several townspeople hurried to help, including Boone, who knelt to gather the scattered materials with surprising gentleness for such large hands. His fingers closed around the Latin primer, and for just a moment he held it as if greeting an old friend. Charlotte knelt beside him, reaching for her books. "Thank you so much. I'm terribly clumsy when I'm tired from traveling." Their hands touched briefly as they both reached for the same volume, and something electric passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Charlotte found herself looking into brown eyes that held far more depth than she'd expected from a simple laborer. Boone was about to hand her the Latin primer when the gilt lettering on its spine caught his eye. Elementa Linguae Latinae. Without thinking, he murmured, "Omnia vincit amor, et nos sidamus amori." The words hung in the morning air like a bell that had been struck. Charlotte's eyes widened in astonishment. Around them, the helping hands grew still as the townspeople processed what they'd just heard. Their silent woodcutter had not only read Latin, but quoted Virgil's eclogues with perfect pronunciation. "You," Charlotte began. But Boone had already risen to his feet, his face flushing with the realization of what he'd revealed. "Your books, miss," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral as he handed her the primer and stepped back toward his woodpile. But the damage was done. Thomas Blackwood stood frozen with Charlotte's scattered teaching materials in his hands. Mrs. Patterson had her mouth slightly agape. Henderson looked as if he'd witnessed a miracle or a deception, he wasn't sure which. Charlotte rose slowly, clutching her books to her chest, her mind racing with questions. "Sir, I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Boone picked up his axe, his knuckles white around the handle. "Name's Boone Carver, miss. I split wood for Mr. Henderson." "Mr. Carver." Charlotte's voice was steady, but her eyes searched his face for answers. "Where did you learn Latin?" The simple question hung between them like a challenge. Around them, the townspeople waited with the eager attention of people witnessing something significant, though they couldn't quite grasp what. Boone looked at the primer in Charlotte's hands, then at the faces surrounding them, curiosity, skepticism, excitement, and something approaching suspicion. The careful anonymity he'd cultivated over 3 years in Millbrook crumbled with those few spoken words. "I pick things up here and there, miss," he said finally, returning to his wood, splitting with perhaps more force than necessary. But Charlotte remained standing where she was, studying the man who had just revealed a mystery that would reshape everything she thought she knew about this frontier town, and perhaps everything the town thought it knew about itself. Hidden beneath his simple work clothes and tucked away in a small wooden box under his bed, Boone still kept a seminary ring, a simple gold band that represented dreams abandoned and a calling forsaken. He'd removed it the day he left Philadelphia, but he'd never found the courage to throw it away entirely. Like his knowledge of Latin, like his understanding of theology and philosophy, it remained part of who he was, beneath the carefully constructed exterior of the prairie woodcutter. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across Main Street, and with Charlotte Whitmore's arrival, the quiet rhythms of Millbrook would never be quite the same again. 3 days passed before Charlotte received the letter, though its arrival felt both inevitable and shocking. She discovered it slipped under her boarding house door on a grey morning, when autumn's chill had settled deep into her bones. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just her name written in crude block letters that suggested someone unaccustomed to holding a pen. Inside, the message was brief and unmistakable. "Miss Whitmore, Dakota Territory has no need for your kind of schooling. Take your books and fancy ideas back east where they belong. This is your only warning." Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, searching for some clue about their author. The paper was common stock, the kind sold at Henderson's general store. The ink had smudged slightly, as if written by someone unused to careful penmanship. But the intent was clear enough. Someone in Millbrook wanted her gone. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, her mind already working through the implications. In her 3 days in town, she'd made courtesy calls on several prominent families, discussing her plans for establishing a proper school. The responses had been mixed, polite interest from some, thinly veiled skepticism from others. Now, it seemed politeness had given way to something more direct. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Whitmore, you have a visitor." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a note of curiosity that suggested the visitor was unexpected. Charlotte smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find Boone Carver standing in the boarding house's narrow hallway, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. He seemed even larger indoors, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. "Mr. Carver, this is unexpected. Miss, I wondered if I might have a word, if it's not too forward of me." Mrs. Patterson hovered nearby with undisguised interest. Charlotte glanced at her landlady, then at Boone. "Perhaps we could speak in the parlor." They settled into the boarding house's modest front room, Boone perched uncomfortably on the edge of a delicate chair that creaked under his weight. Charlotte noticed how carefully he moved, as if constantly aware of his size in relation to the fragile furnishings around him. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, miss. I know it's not proper for me to call on you without introduction. Under the circumstances, I think we can dispense with some formalities." Charlotte studied his face, still puzzled by the contradiction between his appearance and that moment of perfect Latin. "What did you want to discuss, Mr. Carver?" Boone shifted uncomfortably. "I've been hearing talk around town about your school plans. Some folks seem—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Concerned about the changes you're proposing. Concerned enough to send anonymous warnings?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was certain should be crossed. Boone's eyes sharpened, and for just a moment Charlotte glimpsed something calculating beneath his humble exterior. "You received a warning?" "This morning." Charlotte retrieved the letter from her desk and handed it to him. "I assume word of my arrival has spread beyond those who welcomed me publicly." Boone read the letter with the careful attention of someone accustomed to extracting meaning from written words. His jaw tightened slightly as he finished. "This isn't just about the school, miss." "What do you mean?" Boone set the letter aside and leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "There are interests in this territory that prefer people to stay ignorant. Educated folks ask uncomfortable questions about land ownership, cattle contracts, territorial politics. They're harder to manage." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Are you suggesting someone sees my school as a threat to their business interests?" "I'm suggesting you be careful who you trust, Miss Whitmore. Millbrook's not as simple a place as it appears." Before Charlotte could respond, the front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. Thomas Blackwood entered without ceremony, his face flushed with what might have been anger or exertion. "Miss Whitmore, I need to speak with you immediately." His eyes fell on Boone, and his expression hardened. "Carver, I wasn't aware you made social calls on respectable ladies." Boone rose to his feet, his movement fluid despite his size. "Mr. Blackwood, I was just leaving." "See that you do." Blackwood's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "Miss Whitmore and I have important business to discuss." Charlotte watched the exchange with growing irritation. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Carver came to offer assistance with my school preparations. I found his insights quite valuable." "His insights?" Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "Miss Whitmore, you've been in town for 3 days. Perhaps you haven't learned yet that Carver is barely literate. The man splits wood for a living." The words hit their target with devastating precision. Boone's face went carefully blank, but Charlotte saw the flicker of pain in his eyes before he mastered his expression. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, my mistake." Boone picked up his hat and moved toward the door. "Good day, Miss Whitmore." He was gone before Charlotte could protest, leaving her alone with Blackwood and a growing sense that she'd witnessed something both cruel and revealing. "Now then." Blackwood settled into the chair Boone had vacated, his manner suggesting the unpleasantness was concluded. "I've been making inquiries about your school proposal on your father's behalf." "Have you?" "Indeed, and I'm afraid the response has been less enthusiastic than we hoped. Several prominent families have expressed concerns about the necessity of formal education for their children." Charlotte thought of the threatening letter, now lying on the table between them, like evidence of something larger and more troubling than simple resistance to change. "What sort of concerns, Mr. Blackwood?" "The usual worries. That too much book learning will make young people dissatisfied with frontier life. That education should be practical rather than theoretical. That resources might be better spent on more immediate needs." "And what do you think, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood's smile was carefully diplomatic. "I think your father and I have significant business interests that depend on maintaining good relationships in this community. If the community doesn't want a school, perhaps we should respect their wishes." Charlotte rose from her chair, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't travel 1,500 miles to respect the wishes of people who prefer ignorance to enlightenment. If Millbrook doesn't want education, then Millbrook needs it more than I originally thought." The diplomat's mask slipped from Blackwood's face, revealing something harder underneath. "Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll reconsider. Your father sent you here with specific instructions to assess the feasibility of establishing a school. If the assessment shows it's not feasible, then perhaps my assessment will differ from yours." Blackwood stood as well, his height giving him a subtle advantage in the small room. "I hope you won't make hasty decisions based on romantic notions about frontier education. This is a practical country, Miss Whitmore. Practical decisions are the ones that ensure everyone's success." After he left, Charlotte sat alone in the parlor, turning the threatening letter over in her hands. Outside, she could hear the familiar sound of Boone's axe resuming its steady rhythm, each blow ringing across the town like a heartbeat. She thought about his warning, about Blackwood's barely concealed pressure, about the careful way both men had spoken around truths they seemed reluctant to address directly. Something was happening in Millbrook that extended beyond simple resistance to her school, and she was beginning to suspect that the gentle woodcutter who quoted Virgil might be the only person willing to help her understand what it was. The evening brought an unexpected visitor to Boone's modest cabin on the outskirts of town. He was reading by lamplight, a habit that would have surprised the townspeople who assumed he was illiterate, when a soft knock interrupted his concentration. Charlotte stood on his doorstep, wrapped in a dark cloak that made her nearly invisible in the prairie night. "Miss Whitmore." Boone set down his book quickly, though not before Charlotte caught a glimpse of the title. "The Consolation of Philosophy" by Boethius. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone sees—" "Mr. Carver, I need to know what you meant about trusting people in this town." Boone hesitated, then stepped aside to let her enter. His cabin was sparse, but meticulously clean, with books arranged carefully on a single shelf, volumes that would have surprised anyone who considered him merely a woodcutter. "This morning you warned me about interests that prefer people to stay ignorant. This afternoon, Mr. Blackwood essentially ordered me to abandon my school plans. I'm beginning to think these things are connected." Boone poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on his stove, his movements deliberate and careful. "Miss Whitmore, there are things happening in this territory that most folks don't see. Land speculation, cattle contracts that benefit certain parties more than others, political appointments that seem designed to keep local people from asking too many questions. And you think my school threatens these arrangements? I think educated people are harder to deceive, and I think some powerful interests have grown comfortable with deception." Charlotte wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, studying Boone's face in the lamplight. "How do you know these things, Mr. Carver?" A woodcutter wouldn't normally have insight into territorial politics. The question she'd been avoiding since their first meeting hung in the air between them. Boone was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in his simple stone hearth. Finally he spoke. "I wasn't always a woodcutter, Miss Whitmore. What were you?" Another long pause. Then, "Someone who believed that knowledge and faith could make the world better. Someone who learned that believing something doesn't make it true, and that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes." Charlotte sensed that she was approaching the heart of whatever mystery surrounded this enigmatic man. What happened to change that belief? Boone's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where Charlotte now noticed the faint outline of something worn beneath his shirt, something that might have been a chain or cord. "Sometimes the people you're trying to help don't want to be helped, Miss Whitmore, and sometimes the people you trust to help them have other priorities entirely." The cryptic answer only deepened Charlotte's curiosity, but before she could press further, Boone stood and moved to the window. "You should go back to the boarding house now, and Miss Whitmore, be careful who you tell about this conversation." As Charlotte walked back through the dark streets of Millbrook, she realized that her arrival in this frontier town had set in motion forces she was only beginning to understand. The threatening letter seemed less like an isolated incident and more like the first move in a larger game. Behind her, lamplight flickered in Boone Carver's cabin window, and she wondered what other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of this deceptively simple place. Against all expectations and considerable opposition, Charlotte began teaching the following Monday morning in the back room of Henderson's general store. She'd negotiated the temporary arrangement herself, offering to pay rent and promising to disturb neither customers nor inventory. Henderson had agreed reluctantly, swayed more by the prospect of additional income than any enthusiasm for education. Her teaching supplies carefully selected books, slate boards, chalk, and writing materials transformed the dusty storage space into something resembling a proper classroom. She'd shipped these materials from Boston at considerable personal expense, each item chosen with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the right book at the right moment could change a life forever. 7 children appeared that first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Their parents had sent them with various degrees of enthusiasm, some viewing education as an opportunity and others as an unwelcome interruption to more practical pursuits. "Good morning, students," Charlotte began, smoothing her dark blue dress, one of 3 she'd brought specifically for teaching. "Today marks the beginning of something important for all of us." Young Mary Henderson, the storekeeper's daughter, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Whitmore, my papa says we don't need to learn fancy things like they do back east." Charlotte smiled gently. "What do you think, Mary? What would you like to learn?" The girl considered this seriously. "I'd like to know why the stars move across the sky and how birds know which way to fly when winter comes." "Those are wonderful questions. And do you know what? The answers to those questions are found in books written by people who ask the same questions you're asking." Outside, the familiar sound of Boone's axe provided a steady rhythm to the morning's lessons. Charlotte found herself glancing toward the window more frequently than necessary, wondering if he was listening to her teaching or simply focused on his work. During the noon break, as the children scattered to their homes for lunch, Charlotte noticed someone had left a neat stack of firewood beside the store's back entrance, precisely split pieces that would keep her makeshift classroom warm through the approaching winter. Henderson emerged from his store, wiping his hands on his apron. "Didn't order that wood, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps someone made a delivery mistake." "Maybe." Henderson's tone suggested he had his suspicions. "Though I notice Carver's been mighty particular about keeping this area clear of debris lately. Even swept the back steps yesterday, which is more attention than those steps have seen in years." That afternoon brought Charlotte's first real challenge. Thomas Blackwood arrived during her arithmetic lesson with Robert Jameson, one of Millbrook's most prominent cattle ranchers. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood interrupted without ceremony, "Mr. Jameson would like to speak with you about his son's education." Charlotte looked at young Peter Jameson, a bright 12-year-old who had shown particular aptitude for mathematics. "Of course. Peter, please continue with your calculations while I speak with your father." They stepped outside, where Jameson's imposing presence immediately commanded attention. He was a man accustomed to owning vast stretches of land and the livestock that grazed on them, accustomed, in other words, to having his wishes respected without question. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your efforts, but I'm withdrawing Peter from your school." "May I ask why, Mr. Jameson?" "Boy needs to learn ranching, not reading. He'll inherit 10,000 acres someday. That's responsibility enough without filling his head with poetry and philosophy." Charlotte felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. "Mr. Jameson, Peter has remarkable mathematical skills. With proper education, he could manage your ranch more efficiently, understand market trends, even expand your business interests. Or he could get ideas about leaving the ranch for city life." Jameson's tone brooked no argument. "I've seen what too much education does to young people, makes them dissatisfied with honest work." "Education doesn't make people dissatisfied, Mr. Jameson. It gives them choices." "Choices." Jameson repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. Miss Whitmore, choice is a luxury we can't afford out here. Peter's choice was made the day he was born. He'll run the ranch after me, like I did after my father. After Jameson left with his reluctant son, Charlotte found herself standing alone in the afternoon sunlight, watching them drive away. The sound of Boone's axe had stopped, and when she turned, she found him standing near the woodpile, his expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry you witnessed that, Mr. Carver. Nothing to be sorry for, miss. You made good points about education and opportunity." Charlotte studied his face, noting again the careful way he chose his words. "You've been helping, haven't you? The firewood, the swept steps." Boone's hands tightened slightly on his axe handle. "Building's got a back entrance that needed clearing. Henderson pays me to keep the area tidy. Mr. Henderson told me he didn't order the firewood." They looked at each other across the small space between them, and Charlotte saw something in Boone's eyes that suggested he was tired of hiding behind careful deceptions. "Miss Whitmore, there are people in this town who believe in what you're doing, even if they can't say so publicly. Are you one of those people, Mr. Carver?" Instead of answering directly, Boone walked to the woodpile and selected several pieces with particular care. "These are oak. They'll burn longer and steadier than pine. Good for keeping a room warm during long winter lessons." It wasn't a direct answer, but it was answer enough. That evening, Charlotte sat in her boarding house room, preparing lessons for the following day and reflecting on the complicated dynamics she was beginning to understand. Outside her window, she could see lamplight flickering in the windows of Millbrook's scattered homes, families settling in for another night on the frontier, most of them unaware that their quiet community was becoming the center of a larger struggle over education, opportunity, and power. She thought about Peter Jameson, whose quick mind would be devoted to memorizing cattle brands instead of exploring mathematical concepts. She thought about Mary Henderson, whose curiosity about stars and migration patterns would have to be satisfied with whatever fragments of knowledge she could glean from stolen moments with books. And she thought about Boone Carver, whose mysterious past and evident education made him the most puzzling figure in this frontier drama. Each day brought new evidence that he was far more than the simple woodcutter he pretended to be. Yet he seemed determined to maintain the deception. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson appeared with a tea tray and a concerned expression. "Miss Whitmore, I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you having difficulties with your school?" "Some resistance, Mrs. Patterson. Nothing I didn't expect." The older woman set down the tea tray and hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've lived in Millbrook for 15 years, dear. I've seen how things work here, and I want you to know that not everyone opposes what you're doing." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means more than you know. There are forces at work in this territory that prefer to keep people uninformed, Miss Whitmore. They've been successful because most folks are too busy surviving to ask uncomfortable questions, but an educated community would ask those questions." Charlotte set down her pen, giving Mrs. Patterson her full attention. "What sort of questions?" "Questions about land ownership, about cattle contracts, about why certain people seem to profit so handsomely from territorial development while others struggle to maintain their homesteads." The conversation echoed Boone's warnings from the previous evening, and Charlotte began to see the outline of something larger than simple resistance to education. "Mrs. Patterson, do you know anything about Mr. Carver's background?" The boarding house keeper's expression grew thoughtful. "I know he came here 3 years ago with no past that anyone could discover. I know he pays his rent on time, keeps to himself, and has never caused a moment's trouble. And I know that sometimes, late at night, I see lamplight in his cabin and catch glimpses of him reading books that would surprise most folks in this town." "What sort of books?" "Philosophy, theology, sometimes Latin texts that I recognize from my own convent schooling years ago." Mrs. Patterson paused, then added quietly, "I also know that there's a small wooden box under his bed that he thinks no one has seen. It contains things from his former life, things that suggest Mr. Carver wasn't always a frontier laborer." Charlotte felt her heart quicken. "You've seen inside this box?" "Only once, when I was helping him move his belongings after a roof leak last spring. There was a photograph of him in clerical robes and a seminary ring that he clearly treasures but no longer wears." The revelations settled over Charlotte, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. A seminary education would explain Boone's knowledge of Latin, his careful speech, his insights into human nature. It might also explain why he seemed so reluctant to reveal his true background. "Mrs. Patterson, why are you telling me this?" The older woman smiled sadly. "Because I think Mr. Carver sees in your school the same hopes he once had for making the world a better place. And because I think you're both fighting battles that are bigger than either of you realizes." That night, Charlotte lay awake, listening to the prairie wind and thinking about the mysterious woodcutter who split logs with the precision of someone accustomed to careful, deliberate work. Somewhere in his past was a calling abandoned, dreams deferred, perhaps a tragedy that had driven him from his chosen path to this remote frontier town. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to her teaching efforts, new resistance from those who preferred ignorance to enlightenment. But tonight, she found comfort in knowing that she wasn't entirely alone in her mission, that somewhere in the darkness, a former seminarian who quoted Virgil was quietly supporting her efforts to bring education to Millbrook. The worn Bible appeared on Charlotte's makeshift desk on a Thursday morning, open to the Gospel of Matthew and marked with numerous annotations in the margins. The handwriting was precise and scholarly, with Latin notes interspersed among English observations about textual interpretation and theological implications. Charlotte recognized the careful penmanship immediately. She'd seen it on the note that had accompanied her mysterious supply of firewood. But this was far more revealing than firewood or swept steps. This was a window into the mind and soul of the man who had chosen to remain hidden behind the facade of simple labor. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled," read one of the marked passages. Beside it, in Boone's careful script, was written, "True hunger creates its own opportunity for satisfaction. B. C. 1885. She turned the pages carefully, finding similar annotations throughout. These weren't the casual observations of someone who read scripture for comfort. They were the detailed studies of a trained theologian, someone who had wrestled seriously with questions of faith, justice, and human nature. A loose piece of paper fell from between the pages, a letter fragment in the same handwriting, dated 3 years earlier. "The corruption I witnessed in Philadelphia has shaken my faith not in God, but in the institutions that claim to serve him. When the seminary board chose political expediency over moral courage, I could no longer remain. Perhaps in the wilderness, I will find the clarity that eluded me in the city. B. C." Charlotte heard footsteps outside and quickly closed the Bible, but not before noting that several passages about justice and protecting the innocent had been heavily marked. When Henderson entered to check on his inventory, she was calmly preparing her morning lesson. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. I hope you don't mind someone left this Bible for the students to use." Henderson glanced at the book with little interest. "Don't mind at all, Miss Whitmore, though I'd be curious to know who in Millbrook owns such a fine edition. That's seminary quality, that is." After Henderson left, Charlotte reopened the Bible and spent the next hour reading Boone's annotations. They revealed a mind that grappled seriously with questions of social justice, the responsibility of the educated to serve the less fortunate, and the tension between institutional authority and individual conscience. One note, beside the parable of the talents, particularly caught her attention. "Knowledge unused becomes a buried talent. The fear of worldly consequences cannot justify spiritual cowardice." When her students arrived for the morning lesson, Charlotte found herself looking at them with renewed purpose. These children represented more than an educational challenge. They were the reason why someone like Boone Carver had risked revealing his true nature. "Today we're going to talk about courage," she announced. "Who can tell me what courage means?" 8-year-old Annie Morrison raised her hand. It means you're not scared of anything. That's one way to think about it, Annie. But I believe real courage means doing what's right, even when you are scared. Young David Chen, whose father ran the town's small laundry, spoke up. My papa says courage is standing up to people who think they're better than you, just because they have more money. Charlotte smiled. Your father sounds like a wise man, David. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is refuse to accept that our circumstances define our worth. Outside, the sound of Boone's axe had stopped. Through the window, Charlotte caught a glimpse of him listening to her lesson, his expression thoughtful. That afternoon brought an unexpected confrontation. As Charlotte was dismissing her students, 3 rough-looking men appeared in the store's back entrance. She recognized one as Jake Morrison, a ranch hand known for his drinking and volatile temper. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested they were accustomed to intimidating people. Miss Whitmore, Morrison's voice carried a threat, barely concealed by false politeness. We hear you've been filling children's heads with ideas about equality and standing up to their betters. I've been teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, Mr. Morrison. Basic skills that will serve these children well. Basic skills. One of the strangers laughed harshly. Lady, basic skills around here mean knowing how to take orders and not ask too many questions. Charlotte felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. Gentlemen, if you have concerns about my teaching methods, I'd be happy to discuss them with your parents or the town council. We don't need to discuss anything with anybody. Morrison stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. We're here to tell you that some folks think you've overstayed your welcome. Before Charlotte could respond, a shadow filled the doorway behind the 3 men. Boone Carver stood there with his axe still in his hands, and something in his posture suggested it was more than a woodworking tool at the moment. Afternoon, Jake. Boone's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. You boys seem to be making Miss Whitmore uncomfortable. Morrison turned, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. This ain't your business, Carver. Go back to your wood chopping. Actually, Jake, Henderson hired me to keep an eye on his property. That includes making sure his tenants aren't harassed. Boone stepped into the room, and the 3 men suddenly seemed smaller by comparison. I think you gentlemen should move along. The strangers exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Morrison, however, was too drunk or too angry to back down. You think because you're big that makes you important. You're nothing but a dumb ox who splits wood for pennies. Boone's expression didn't change, but Charlotte caught something in his eyes, a flash of pain that Morrison's crude words had found their mark. You're right, Jake. I'm just a woodcutter, but I'm a woodcutter who's standing between you and Miss Whitmore, and I'm not moving. The quiet authority in Boone's voice seemed to penetrate even Morrison's alcohol-fueled bravado. After a moment of tense silence, one of the strangers touched Morrison's arm. Come on, Jake. We delivered the message. Let's go. After they left, Charlotte found herself alone with Boone in the small classroom. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the careful way he was controlling his breathing, the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his axe. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm not sure how that would have ended without your intervention. They were trying to frighten you into leaving, Miss Whitmore. It's an old tactic. Have you seen it used before? Boone was quiet for a long moment, staring at the Bible that still lay open on Charlotte's desk. I've seen what happens when good people remain silent in the face of intimidation, and I've seen what happens when they don't. Charlotte sensed an opening, a chance to bridge the careful distance he maintained. Mr. Carver, I found your Bible very enlightening. His eyes snapped to hers, and she saw both wariness and something that might have been relief. I thought you might benefit from some additional teaching materials. Your annotations suggest extensive theological training. I had some education before I came here. Seminary education. It wasn't a question, and Boone seemed to recognize that denial would be pointless. He nodded slowly. Philadelphia Seminary. I was 2 years from ordination when... He stopped, his jaw tightening. When what? Boone walked to the window, looking out at the town where he'd spent 3 years hiding from whatever had driven him west. "When I learned that institutional authority and moral authority aren't always the same thing, Miss Whitmore. When I discovered that sometimes the church protects its interests more carefully than it protects the people it's supposed to serve." Charlotte heard the pain in his voice, the disillusionment that had shattered not just his career, but his faith in the very institutions he'd devoted his life to serving. "What happened?" "There was a scandal involving the seminary board and some prominent Philadelphia families. Financial improprieties, moral compromises, political arrangements that put the church's reputation ahead of justice for people who had been wronged." Boone's hands clenched into fists. "I spoke out. The board chose to protect their benefactors rather than investigate the allegations. So you left. I was given a choice: remain silent and continue toward ordination, or face expulsion for divisive behavior. I chose to leave before they could force me out." Charlotte felt a deep sadness for this man who had sacrificed his calling rather than compromise his principles. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." It was. Boone turned back to face her, and she saw that his brown eyes held both pain and a carefully guarded hope. "But perhaps it led me to where I needed to be. Perhaps there are other ways to serve God than wearing clerical robes." "Is that why you've been helping with my school?" "Education is a form of ministry, Miss Whitmore. Knowledge can free people from ignorance and oppression just as surely as faith can free them from despair." For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Charlotte felt she was seeing the real Boone Carver, not the carefully constructed facade of the simple woodcutter, but the educated, principled man who had chosen exile rather than compromise his beliefs. "Mr. Carver, Boone, what you've told me explains so much about why certain people in this town seem threatened by education. Ignorant people are easier to control, Charlotte. They're less likely to question unfair contracts, suspicious land deals, or political arrangements that benefit a few at the expense of many." The use of her first name marked a shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement that pretense was no longer necessary between them. "Is that what's happening here? Are there people who profit from keeping the community ignorant?" Boone glanced toward the front of the store, where Henderson could be heard helping customers. "There are powerful interests in this territory who have grown comfortable with the status quo. Your school represents change, and change threatens their advantages. The threats, the pressure to abandon my teaching, you think they're part of something larger? I think you've stumbled into the middle of a struggle you may not fully understand yet, and I think you're going to need allies if you plan to continue." Charlotte looked at this man who had revealed so much of himself in the space of an afternoon: his education, his principles, his painful past, and his quiet commitment to supporting her mission despite the personal cost. "Are you offering to be one of those allies?" Boone's answer came without hesitation. "I've been hiding from my calling for 3 years, Charlotte. Maybe it's time I remembered that some fights are worth having, regardless of the consequences." As evening approached and Charlotte prepared to return to the boarding house, she realized that everything had changed. The mysterious woodcutter had revealed himself to be a trained theologian whose principles had cost him his career. The threatening visit from Morrison and his companions had shown that opposition to her school was becoming more organized and dangerous. But for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Charlotte felt she wasn't facing these challenges alone. In Boone Carver, she had found not just an ally, but someone who understood the deeper significance of what they were fighting for, the belief that education could transform lives and that knowledge was a form of liberation that no earthly authority should be allowed to suppress. The land survey documents arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by a nervous clerk from the territorial office who seemed eager to complete his business and leave town quickly. Charlotte was teaching her morning arithmetic lesson when Henderson interrupted with unusual urgency. "Miss Whitmore, there's a fellow here with official papers. Says he needs to speak with you and Mr. Blackwood immediately." The documents spread across Henderson's counter told a story that made Charlotte's blood run cold. Detailed surveys, mineral rights assessments, and railroad development plans revealed that Millbrook and the surrounding territory were sitting on valuable resources that certain parties were very interested in acquiring. Thomas Blackwood arrived within minutes, his face grim as he studied the papers. "This explains a great deal," he murmured, then caught himself and glanced sharply at Charlotte. "Miss Whitmore, these are confidential territorial business documents. Perhaps you should return to your teaching." "Mr. Blackwood, these surveys include the land where I'm planning to build my permanent school. I believe I have a right to understand what's happening." The clerk, a thin young man named Peters, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, these documents show planned railroad development through this region within the next 2 years. There's also been some interest in mineral surveys. Seems there might be silver deposits in the hills east of town." Charlotte felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "And I suppose certain parties have been quietly acquiring land rights in anticipation of these developments." Peter's silence was answer enough. Blackwood's expression had grown increasingly dark as he read through the surveys. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood said carefully, "these developments could bring prosperity to Millbrook. New businesses, more families, increased opportunities for everyone, including increased opportunities for the people who own the land when the railroad comes through." Before Blackwood could respond, Boone appeared in the store entrance. He'd obviously been listening from outside, and his face was grim. "Mr. Carver," Blackwood's tone carried warning, "this is a private business discussion." "Is it private when it affects every person in this town?" Boone stepped forward, his size suddenly seeming less gentle and more formidable. "Because if there's railroad money involved, and if certain people have been buying up land quietly, then I'd say this affects all of us." Peters looked nervously between the three of them. "I should mention there have been some irregularities in recent land transactions. Sales that happened very quickly, sometimes to buyers who weren't local residents." "What kind of irregularities?" Charlotte demanded. "Purchases made through intermediaries, prices that were unusually low, sellers who seemed—" Peters paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unusually motivated to sell quickly." Boone's jaw tightened. "Motivated how?" "Some families received visits from men who explained that railroad development would require certain properties. They were offered the choice of selling at the suggested price or facing eminent domain proceedings later." Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest. They were threatened. "Now, Miss Whitmore," Blackwood interjected, "territorial development requires difficult decisions. Sometimes individual interests must yield to the greater good." "Whose definition of the greater good, Mr. Blackwood?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Peters gathered his papers quickly, clearly anxious to escape the growing tension. "I should be getting back to the territorial office. Good day to you all." After he left, the three of them stood in Henderson's store, surrounded by the implications of what they'd learned. Charlotte's mind was racing through connections she hadn't seen before: the resistance to her school, the threatening letter, the organized effort to intimidate her into leaving. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "I'm beginning to understand why some people might oppose education in Millbrook. Educated people ask inconvenient questions about land deals and development rights." Blackwood's diplomatic mask was slipping. "Miss Whitmore, you're suggesting conspiracies where none exist. Territorial development is a complex process that requires keeping the local population ignorant of what's being done to them," Boone interrupted. His voice carried an authority that neither Charlotte nor Blackwood had heard before. "It requires people who won't ask why their neighbors are suddenly eager to sell family homesteads, or why certain buyers seem to have advanced knowledge of railroad routes." "Carver, you're overstepping yourself." "Am I?" Boone's brown eyes had gone hard. "Or am I finally speaking up when I should have been speaking up all along?" Charlotte looked between the two men and realized she was witnessing something significant. Not just a disagreement about territorial development, but a moment when carefully maintained pretenses were falling away. "Mr. Blackwood," she said slowly, "are you part of this land acquisition scheme?" The direct question seemed to surprise him. For a moment, his careful politician's facade cracked, revealing something calculating underneath. "Miss Whitmore, your father and I have legitimate business interests throughout this territory. We're not required to apologize for recognizing opportunities for profitable investment, even if those opportunities depend on keeping the local population uninformed. The local population will benefit from development, regardless of their level of education." "Will they?" Charlotte's voice was rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "Will they benefit when their land has been purchased for a fraction of its true value? Will they benefit when the railroad brings prosperity to people who bought cheap land through deception and intimidation?" Blackwood's expression had gone cold. "Miss Whitmore, I think you should reconsider your position very carefully. Your father sent you here with specific expectations, and I'm not certain your current activities align with those expectations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Are you suggesting that my father is involved in these land schemes?" "I'm suggesting that your father is a practical businessman who understands the realities of territorial development. And I'm suggesting that you might want to discuss your school plans with him before making any permanent commitments." After Blackwood left, Charlotte and Boone stood alone in Henderson's store, both of them processing the implications of what they'd learned. Henderson had discreetly withdrawn to his back room, leaving them privacy for their conversation. "It's bigger than we thought," Charlotte said finally. "Much bigger and more dangerous." Boone walked to the window, watching Blackwood's carriage disappear down Main Street. "If there's railroad money involved, and if powerful people have been positioning themselves to profit from development, then your school represents a serious threat to their plans. Because educated people would ask questions about the land sales. Because educated people would organize resistance. They'd demand fair prices for their property. They'd insist on community input into development plans. They'd be much harder to manipulate." Charlotte thought about her students' bright children, whose futures were being shaped by forces they couldn't even see. "What do we do?" "We continue teaching. We help people understand what's happening to their community. And we prepare for the fact that the opposition is going to get much more serious." Boone's tone carried the weight of someone who had faced difficult choices before. Charlotte found herself looking at him with new respect, not just for his hidden education, but for his willingness to risk exposure in service of something larger than himself. "Boone, if we oppose this openly, you'll be risking more than I will. People expect resistance from an Eastern schoolteacher. They don't expect it from a local laborer." "Charlotte, 3 years ago I walked away from a fight because the cost seemed too high. I've regretted that decision every day since." His hands clenched into fists. "I won't make the same mistake twice." That evening, Charlotte sat in her boarding house room, staring at a letter from her father that had arrived on the afternoon stage. His words, which would have seemed innocuous a week earlier, now carried ominous implications. "My dear Charlotte, I trust your assessment of Millbrook's educational needs is proceeding smoothly. Thomas Blackwood has been most helpful in facilitating your visit, and I rely on his judgment regarding the community's readiness for formal schooling. I look forward to your report on the feasibility of establishing a permanent school, and I trust you will consider all factors educational, social, and economic in making your recommendations. Your loving father, Jonathan Whitmore." The careful phrasing suggested that her father expected her to reach conclusions that aligned with Blackwood's preferences. The question was whether those preferences served the community's interests or the interests of land speculators who stood to profit from keeping Millbrook's residents uninformed about the true value of their property. Outside her window, lamplight flickered in Boone's cabin, and Charlotte wondered what he was thinking as he processed the day's revelations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures to abandon her teaching mission, but tonight she felt a determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had come to Millbrook to teach children reading and arithmetic, Now she understood that she was fighting for something much larger, the right of a community to make informed decisions about its own future, and the principle that knowledge should serve justice rather than exploitation. The land survey documents had revealed the true stakes of the struggle she'd stumbled into. Now the question was whether she and her unlikely ally would have the courage and wisdom to see it through to whatever end awaited them. The faded photograph fell from Boone's jacket pocket as he helped Charlotte rearrange the classroom furniture on a grey December morning. It landed face up on the wooden floor, revealing an image that made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat. The young man in seminary robes bore little resemblance to the weathered woodcutter she knew, yet the eyes were unmistakably the same, brown, intelligent, and filled with purpose. He stood among a group of fellow seminarians in front of an imposing Gothic building, their faces bright with the confidence of young men called to serve God and humanity. Boone quickly retrieved the photograph, but not before Charlotte had seen the inscription on the back. Philadelphia Seminary, class of 1885. Let justice roll down like waters. Amos 5:24. I'm sorry, Charlotte said quietly. I didn't mean to intrude on your private memories. Boone studied the photograph for a long moment before carefully returning it to his pocket. It's not an intrusion, Charlotte. I've been carrying this with me for 3 years, and perhaps it's time I stopped treating my past like a guilty secret. They were alone in the makeshift classroom, preparing for what might be their last day of regular instruction. Word had spread through Millbrook that territorial officials would be arriving soon to discuss development plans, and the pressure on Charlotte to suspend her teaching had intensified dramatically. Will you tell me about it? She asked gently. About what happened in Philadelphia? Boone settled into one of the small chairs, looking incongruous but determined. The seminary was more than an educational institution, Charlotte. It was supposed to be a moral beacon for the community, a place where future ministers learned not just theology, but the courage to speak truth to power. He paused, staring out the window at the prairie landscape that had become his refuge from the past. There was a man named Harrison Caldwell, one of the seminary's most generous benefactors. He owned textile mills throughout Philadelphia, and his donations funded scholarships for promising theology students, including mine. Charlotte heard the pain in his voice and waited patiently for him to continue. In my final year, stories began to surface about conditions in Caldwell's mills. Children working 14-hour days, unsafe machinery, wages so low that entire families lived in squalor despite working themselves to exhaustion. When mill workers tried to organize for better conditions, they were fired and blacklisted from other employment. What did you do? What I was trained to do, I investigated. I visited the mills, spoke with workers, documented the conditions they faced. I believed that the seminary board would want to know how their benefactor was treating the most vulnerable members of our community. Boone's laugh held no humor. I was young and idealistic enough to think that evidence of injustice would automatically lead to action for justice. But it didn't. The board thanked me for my concern and assured me that they would look into the allegations. Weeks passed with no action. Meanwhile, conditions at the mills worsened. Workers who had spoken with me began facing harassment and termination. Charlotte felt her heart aching for the young idealist who had learned such a painful lesson about institutional priorities. I couldn't remain silent. I prepared a detailed report and presented it to the full seminary board, requesting that they either demand reforms from Caldwell or return his donations on moral grounds. How did they respond? They gave me a choice: withdraw my allegations and continue toward ordination, or face immediate expulsion for conduct unbecoming a future minister of the gospel. Boone's hands clenched. They explained that alienating major benefactors would harm the seminary's ability to train future ministers, and that the greater good required maintaining these important relationships. So you left. I couldn't sign a document declaring that my concerns were unfounded when I knew they weren't. I couldn't begin my ministry by agreeing that moral compromise was acceptable when it served institutional interests. He looked directly at Charlotte. I chose principle over pragmatism, and it cost me everything I'd worked toward. Charlotte felt a deep admiration for this man, who had sacrificed his calling rather than betray his conscience. "Do you regret your decision?" "I regret that I was naive enough to think the institution would automatically do the right thing. I regret that my idealism may have made conditions worse for the mill workers who trusted me, but I don't regret refusing to sign that document." "What happened after you left?" Boone's expression grew darker. Caldwell increased his donations to the seminary. The mill workers who had spoken with me were systematically fired or transferred to worse positions. And I learned that sometimes individual integrity isn't enough to overcome institutional corruption. Charlotte understood now why Boone had been so reluctant to involve himself in her educational mission. His previous attempt to fight injustice had ended in failure and exile. "Is that why you came here? To escape the consequences of speaking out?" "I came here to hide from the knowledge that good intentions aren't enough, that individual courage means nothing without institutional support." Boone met her eyes. "But watching what's happening to this community, seeing the same pattern of exploitation and manipulation, I'm beginning to think that hiding isn't the answer." Before Charlotte could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were dismounting in front of Henderson's store, well-dressed men whose bearing suggested they were accustomed to authority and unaccustomed to resistance. "Territorial officials," Boone observed grimly. "And if I'm not mistaken, that's Harrison Caldwell's younger brother with them." Charlotte's heart sank. The mill owner from Philadelphia? The same family. It seems the tentacles of corruption reach farther than I realized. They watched as the men entered Henderson's store, obviously expecting to conduct important business. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered Blackwood, several prominent ranchers, and other townspeople who had been conspicuously absent from discussions about Charlotte's school. "They're here to finalize the land acquisition plans," Charlotte said, "and to make sure there's no organized resistance from the community. Which means they're here to make sure your school doesn't continue." Charlotte felt a familiar surge of determination. "Then perhaps it's time we stopped hiding our intentions as well." That afternoon, as the territorial officials conducted their meetings with Millbrook's business leaders, Charlotte and Boone made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for events to overtake them, they would force the community to confront what was happening. Charlotte stood before her small class of students and their parents, who had been invited for a special lesson. Boone stood beside her, having finally abandoned any pretense of being merely the local woodcutter. "Today we're going to talk about citizenship," Charlotte began, "about the rights and responsibilities that come with living in a democracy." She pulled out a map of the territory and pointed to the areas marked for railroad development. "Who can tell me what happens when a railroad comes through a community?" Young David Chen raised his hand. "It brings jobs and prosperity?" "That's what we're told," Charlotte agreed. "But what happens to the people who own land where the railroad wants to build?" The question sparked an animated discussion among the children and their parents. As the conversation developed, Charlotte and Boone carefully guided it toward questions about fair compensation, community involvement in development decisions, and the importance of having complete information before making choices about the future. By the end of the session, the small classroom was buzzing with conversations that extended far beyond reading and arithmetic. Parents were asking questions about recent land sales in their neighborhood. Older students were wondering why some families had suddenly decided to sell homesteads they'd worked for years to establish. As the families left, Charlotte noticed several parents heading directly toward Henderson's store, where the territorial officials were still conducting their meetings. The carefully managed information session was about to encounter some unexpectedly informed and organized community input. "Well," Boone said quietly, "we've certainly committed ourselves now." Charlotte looked at this man who had sacrificed his calling once before for the sake of principle, and who was now risking everything again to support her mission. Do you think we have a chance of making a difference this time? Boone's answer came without hesitation. I think we have something I didn't have in Philadelphia, a community that's worth fighting for, and allies who understand that some principles are more important than institutional approval. That evening brought the confrontation Charlotte had been expecting since her arrival in Millbrook. Thomas Blackwood appeared at the boarding house with two of the territorial officials and an ultimatum that was politely phrased but unmistakably final. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood's voice carried the weight of official authority. "After consulting with territorial representatives and community leaders, we've concluded that Millbrook is not ready for formal educational programs at this time." "Based on what criteria, Mr. Blackwood?" "Based on community needs, available resources, and territorial development priorities." One of the officials, a thin man with calculating eyes, stepped forward. "We understand you've been encouraging local residents to question legitimate territorial business decisions. I've been teaching children to read, write, and think critically about their world. Miss Whitmore," the official's tone hardened, "territorial development requires community cooperation, not community agitation. Your teaching methods appear designed to create resistance to proper authority." Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "Gentlemen, I've been teaching basic literacy and citizenship skills. If those skills create resistance to your plans, perhaps you should examine your plans rather than my teaching." The threat that followed was delivered with bureaucratic precision. Charlotte would cease her teaching activities immediately and return to Boston on the next available transportation. Failure to comply would result in territorial authorities taking whatever steps were necessary to maintain community stability. As the men left, Charlotte stood alone in the boarding house parlor, processing the reality that her educational mission had officially ended in failure. But as she looked out the window toward Boone's cabin, where lamplight glowed steadily in the darkness, she realized that failure and defeat were not necessarily the same thing. The photograph of young seminarians committed to justice had revealed more than Boone's personal history. It had shown her that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who have already lost everything once and found the courage to risk everything again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new forms of resistance to the forces that sought to control Millbrook's future. But tonight, Charlotte found herself looking forward to those challenges with a confidence that surprised her. She was no longer fighting alone, and she was no longer fighting for abstract principles. She was fighting alongside someone who understood both the cost of moral compromise and the redemption that could come from refusing to compromise again. The forged deed arrived with Charlotte's morning coffee, delivered by Mrs. Patterson with shaking hands and a face pale with shock. The document bore official territorial seals and signatures, but something about its appearance immediately struck Charlotte as wrong. The paper was too new, the ink too fresh for something supposedly filed months earlier. "Where did you get this, Mrs. Patterson?" "Someone slipped it under my door during the night, dear." Along with this note, the older woman handed Charlotte a folded paper written in the same crude handwriting as the original threatening letter. "It says you need to see what's really happening before it's too late." Charlotte spread the deed across her small desk and read with growing amazement. According to the document, Thomas Blackwood had purchased her father's ranch properties in the territory 6 months earlier, properties that Charlotte knew her father still considered his own. The signatures looked authentic, but the dates were impossible. "This has to be a forgery," she murmured, but even as she spoke, pieces of a larger puzzle began clicking into place. Her father's reluctance to discuss his territorial investments, Blackwood's assumption of authority over her mission, the convenient timing of territorial development plans that seemed designed to benefit specific landowners. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Boone standing in the hallway, his expression grim. "Charlotte, we need to talk. Something's happened that changes everything." They walked quickly to his cabin, where Boone had spread additional documents across his small table papers that had apparently been delivered to his door in the same mysterious manner. Land deeds, mineral rights transfers, railroad contracts, he explained, pointing to the various documents, all bearing dates from the past year, all involving properties throughout this region. Charlotte examined the papers with growing alarm. These signatures, they look like my father's handwriting, but the dates are wrong. According to these documents, he sold his interest in half the territory months before I even arrived. Look at this one. Boone handed her a railroad development contract. It shows Blackwood as the primary local coordinator for land acquisition, with authority to negotiate on behalf of Eastern investors, including your father. Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Boone, if these documents are accurate, then my father has been planning this territorial development for over a year. He sent me here not to assess the feasibility of a school, but to provide cover for land acquisition schemes. That's what I'm afraid of. Boone's voice was heavy with implications. Your presence gave Blackwood legitimacy, the daughter of a respected Eastern businessman coming to establish a school. It made the territorial development look like community improvement rather than exploitation. The realization hit Charlotte like a physical blow. I've been an unwitting accomplice to everything I've been fighting against. Before Boone could respond, Henderson appeared at the cabin door, his face flushed with anger and excitement. Carver, Miss Whitmore, you need to come to the store immediately. Jake Morrison's there with some disturbing news about these land deals. They followed Henderson back to the general store, where they found Morrison waiting with several other townspeople. The ranch hand, who had threatened Charlotte weeks earlier, now seemed genuinely frightened. Miss Whitmore, Morrison began without preamble, I owe you an apology. Those men who came with me to scare you, they weren't just local troublemakers. They were hired by Blackwood to pressure families into selling their land. How do you know this? Because Blackwood hired me too. Offered me $50 to organize community resistance to your school, said educated folks would interfere with territorial development plans. Morrison's hands shook as he spoke. I needed the money, so I took the job. But I didn't know what I was really signing up for. Charlotte felt her heart racing. What did you discover? Blackwood's been using forged documents to claim ownership of properties throughout the region. He has fake deeds, mineral rights transfers, even railroad contracts that don't exist in the territorial records. Boone stepped forward, his expression dangerous. You're saying the documents we received this morning are copies of the real forged papers Blackwood's been using to steal land from local families? Morrison pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. This is the evidence I was supposed to destroy after you left town. But what he's doing, it's not right. People are losing their homes based on lies. Charlotte examined the contents of Morrison's envelope with growing horror. The documents matched the ones they'd received that morning, but these bore notations in Blackwood's handwriting, instructions for local officials, payment schedules for accomplices, and a list of properties targeted for acquisition. My God, she whispered. He's been systematically defrauding every landowner in the region. Gets worse, Morrison continued. The territorial officials who visited yesterday, they're not real government representatives. They're Blackwood's associates from back east, here to finalize the illegal land transfers before anyone discovers what's happening. Boone's theological training had taught him to look for patterns of corruption, and now he saw the full scope of what they were facing. Charlotte, your father may not be willingly involved in this scheme. If Blackwood has been forging his signature on documents, then my father is a victim too, and I've been used to provide legitimacy for massive fraud. Charlotte's voice cracked with the weight of understanding. Everyone who opposed my school, everyone who wanted me to leave, they weren't protecting tradition or resisting change. They were trying to prevent me from accidentally discovering what Blackwood was doing. Henderson had been listening with growing agitation. Miss Whitmore, if this is true, then half the families in Millbrook are about to lose their property to thieves. It's true, Morrison said grimly. And it gets worse. Blackwood's planning to file all the forged deeds with territorial authorities next week. Once they're officially recorded, the original landowners will have no legal recourse. Charlotte felt the room spinning around her. In the space of an hour, everything she thought she understood about her mission in Millbrook had been turned upside down. She hadn't come to fight ignorance, she'd come as an unwitting agent of one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes in territorial history. But as the shock began to wear off, Charlotte felt something else rising in her chest, not despair, but a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. "Boone," she said quietly, "remember what you told me about individual integrity not being enough to overcome institutional corruption?" "Yes, well, now we're not just individuals anymore. We're a community that knows what's happening and has evidence to prove it." Boone looked at the papers scattered across Henderson's counter, then at the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to hear Morrison's revelations. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, he saw a chance to fight corruption with more than just personal integrity. "What are you proposing?" Charlotte's answer came with the clarity of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the battle she was fighting. "I'm proposing that we use every skill we have, your theological training, my education, this community's determination to expose this fraud before Blackwood can complete it. That means going up against powerful interests with connections to territorial government. Then we'd better make sure we have our facts straight and our strategy sound." Charlotte looked around the room at faces that had gone from confusion to understanding to grim determination. "Because we're not just fighting for a school anymore, we're fighting for the survival of this entire community." Henderson spoke for everyone present. "Miss Whitmore, what do you need us to do?" As Charlotte began outlining a plan that would require all of their combined courage and intelligence, she realized that her educational mission had evolved into something far more significant than she'd ever imagined. She had come to Millbrook to teach children how to read and write. Now she was going to teach an entire community how to fight for justice. The forged deed that had revealed Blackwood's scheme lay spread across Henderson's counter like a declaration of war. Charlotte touched its edge gently, understanding that this document represented both the betrayal of everything she'd believed about her mission and the opportunity to fulfill that mission in ways she'd never dreamed possible. Tomorrow would bring the most dangerous phase of their struggle. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Charlotte felt that they had a real chance of winning. The hidden arsenal beneath Boone's cabin floor would have shocked anyone who still believed he was merely a woodcutter. 2 Winchester rifles, a Colt revolver, ammunition carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, and strategic supplies that spoke of someone who understood the principles of defensive warfare. But more revealing than the weapons themselves were the detailed maps and tactical notes that accompanied them, evidence of a mind trained not just in theology, but in the practical realities of protecting innocent people from those who would exploit them. Charlotte knelt beside Boone in the lamplit cellar space, studying the preparations he'd been making since Morrison's revelations 3 days earlier. The scope of his planning revealed another layer of the mystery that surrounded this enigmatic man. "Seminary training doesn't usually include tactical warfare," she observed quietly. "My father was a Union officer during the war," Boone replied, checking the action on one of the rifles. "He taught me that sometimes righteous causes require practical skills that seminary professors don't discuss in their lectures about turning the other cheek." Above them, they could hear the sounds of Millbrook preparing for what everyone now understood would be a decisive confrontation. Word had spread through the community about Blackwood's fraud scheme, and the response had surprised even Charlotte with its unanimity. Families who had never agreed on anything were now united in their determination to protect their homes and their children's future. "The territorial marshal arrives tomorrow morning," Charlotte said, reviewing their timeline one final time. "Blackwood doesn't know we've sent word to the real authorities, so he'll proceed with filing the forged documents. Which means we need to have everything in place before he realizes what's happening." Boone secured the weapons and moved to a table where he'd spread detailed diagrams of Millbrook's street layout. "Henderson and Morrison will position themselves here with a clear view of the territorial office. Mrs. Patterson and the other women will ensure the children are safely away from the main street." Charlotte traced the planned positions with her finger, marveling at the transformation of their educational mission into something resembling a military operation. And if Blackwood's men resort to violence when they realize they've been exposed, then we'll be ready. Boone's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had thought through every contingency. "But Charlotte, our primary weapon isn't going to be rifles or tactical positioning. It's going to be the truth, properly documented and presented to legitimate authorities. The truth was indeed their most powerful asset." Over the past 3 days, they had assembled a comprehensive case against Blackwood's scheme, forged documents, witness testimony, financial records that revealed the scope of the fraud. Morrison had provided detailed accounts of how the intimidation campaign had been organized. Henderson had documented which families had been pressured into selling property at artificially low prices. Most importantly, they had established contact with Charlotte's father through carefully worded telegrams that revealed Blackwood's deception without alerting territorial officials who might be compromised. Jonathan Whitmore's response had been swift and decisive. He was traveling immediately to Millbrook with legitimate territorial representatives and legal authority to investigate the land fraud allegations. "My father's message said he'll arrive on tomorrow evening's stage," Charlotte said, checking her pocket watch. "That gives us roughly 18 hours to maintain the illusion that Blackwood's plan is proceeding normally. Can you do that? Can you face him tomorrow morning knowing what you know and not reveal that we've discovered his scheme?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. The past week had tested her in ways she'd never imagined, transforming her from an idealistic schoolteacher into someone capable of strategic deception when justice required it. "I can do whatever is necessary to protect this community," she said finally. "The question is whether Blackwood will suspect that something has changed." Boone's expression was grim but determined. "He'll suspect. Men like Blackwood don't survive by trusting appearances. But by the time he acts on his suspicions, we'll be ready for him." They climbed back up to the cabin's main room, where the preparations took on an almost domestic quality. Charlotte checked the lamp oil. They would need steady light for the documents they'd be reviewing with the marshal. Boone ensured their evidence was organized in logical sequence, with the most damning documents easily accessible. "There's something I need to tell you," Charlotte said as they completed their preparations. "Something I should have said days ago." Boone paused in his work, giving her his full attention. "When I came to Millbrook, I thought I was bringing education to people who needed enlightenment. I thought the resistance I encountered was based on ignorance or tradition." Charlotte met his eyes directly. "I was wrong about almost everything, but I was especially wrong about you." "Charlotte, let me finish. You've sacrificed your anonymity, risked your safety, and used skills I'm only beginning to understand all to support a mission that you had no obligation to support. You've taught me more about courage and principle than any professor I studied under in Boston." Boone was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried emotions he'd kept carefully controlled for months. "Charlotte, 3 years ago, I walked away from my calling because I thought individual conscience wasn't enough to overcome institutional corruption. Watching you refuse to abandon your students, even when powerful interests demanded it, seeing how education can awaken a community's sense of justice, you've shown me that my calling isn't lost. It's just evolved into something different than wearing clerical robes." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the cabin door. Henderson appeared with Morrison and several other townspeople, their expressions serious but determined. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Carver," Henderson began, "we've finished the preparations you requested. Every family knows their role for tomorrow. The children are staying with relatives outside town, and we've posted watchers on all the roads leading into Millbrook." Morrison stepped forward, his transformation from Blackwood's hired intimidator to community protector complete. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to know every person in this town understands what you've done for us. You came here to teach our children, and you ended up saving our community." Charlotte felt her throat tighten with emotion. "We haven't saved anything yet, Mr. Morrison. Tomorrow will determine whether we've been clever enough to outmaneuver Thomas Blackwood." "Maybe so," Henderson replied, "but you've already saved the most important thing. You've saved our ability to fight for ourselves. Before you came, we were isolated families who could be picked off one by one. Now, we're a community that stands together." After the others left, Charlotte and Boone stood together in the cabin's main room, surrounded by the evidence they'd gathered and the weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. Outside, Millbrook was settling into an uneasy quiet, like a town preparing for a storm that everyone could see approaching. "Are you frightened?" Charlotte asked. "Terrified," Boone admitted, "but also more alive than I've felt since leaving Philadelphia. Fear means we understand the stakes, and the stakes are worth being afraid for." Charlotte looked at this man who had hidden his true nature for 3 years, only to risk everything when justice required it. Tomorrow would test every skill they possessed: her education, his strategic thinking, the community's newfound unity. Success would mean preserving not just property rights, but the principle that knowledge should serve justice rather than exploitation. "Boone," she said quietly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you has changed everything I thought I knew about courage, about faith, and about what it means to serve something larger than yourself." His response came without hesitation. "Charlotte, you came to Millbrook to teach children how to read. Instead, you taught an entire community how to stand up for itself. That's not just education, that's transformation." As they prepared for sleep in the hours before what might be the most important day in Millbrook's history, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived as an Eastern schoolteacher with idealistic notions about frontier education. Tomorrow, she would face down one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes in territorial history, backed by a community that had learned to value knowledge as a weapon against injustice. The hidden arsenal beneath the cabin floor represented more than tactical preparation. It represented the recognition that sometimes protecting innocent people required more than good intentions and moral courage. But the real power they would wield tomorrow lay not in weapons, but in truth carefully documented and presented to legitimate authorities by people who refused to remain silent in the face of exploitation. Millbrook was ready for whatever Thomas Blackwood might attempt when he discovered that his carefully constructed scheme had been exposed. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had once thought her greatest challenge would be teaching children their letters, was ready to teach the entire territory a lesson about the power of education to serve justice. The bronze school bell that Charlotte had ordered from Boston arrived on the morning stage, just as Thomas Blackwood was preparing to file his forged documents with the territorial office. The timing was not coincidental. Charlotte had carefully orchestrated the delivery to serve as both symbol and signal for what was about to unfold. The bell's clear bronze voice rang across Millbrook's main street for the first time, calling not students to class, but citizens to witness the exposure of the greatest fraud in the territory's history. As its sound echoed off the storefronts and saloons, people emerged from their businesses and homes with the purposeful movement of a community that had prepared for this moment. Blackwood paused on the steps of the territorial office, his stack of forged documents in hand, and looked around with the first stirrings of unease. Something about the morning felt different, too organized, too deliberate for coincidence. "Beautiful bell, Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte called from across the street, where she stood beside Henderson's store with a growing crowd of townspeople. "It's amazing how sound can carry such distance. Why, I wouldn't be surprised if people could hear it all the way to the territorial capital." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Charlotte's confident demeanor. This was not the defeated schoolteacher he'd expected to see packing her belongings for the journey back east. "Miss Whitmore, I thought you'd concluded your business in Millbrook." "Oh, I have concluded my original business, Mr. Blackwood. But it seems I've discovered an entirely new educational opportunity." Charlotte stepped forward, holding a leather portfolio that made Blackwood's face go pale. Did you know that document forgery provides excellent lessons in handwriting analysis, legal procedures, and civic responsibility? The crowd around Charlotte began to murmur with anticipation. Henderson appeared beside her, followed by Morrison, Mrs. Patterson, and other townspeople who had spent days preparing for this confrontation. Blackwood glanced toward the territorial office, where his two associates waited with barely concealed impatience. They had planned to complete the document filing before noon, then disappear before anyone could question the legitimacy of their transactions. Miss Whitmore, I'm not sure what you think you've discovered, but territorial business is not appropriate subject matter for amateur investigation. Amateur? Charlotte opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that made Blackwood take an involuntary step backward. Mr. Blackwood, I'd like you to examine this deed and tell me if you recognize the signature. She held up one of the forged documents that Morrison had provided, with Blackwood's handwriting clearly visible in the margins. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, finally understanding the scope of what their schoolteacher had uncovered. That document is confidential territorial business, Blackwood snapped, but his voice carried the strain of someone whose carefully constructed plans were unraveling. Is it? Boone's voice carried across the street as he approached from the direction of the telegraph office. Because according to the territorial marshal's office, no such documents were ever filed through official channels. Blackwood spun to face this new threat, his diplomatic mask finally slipping to reveal the calculating predator underneath. Carver, I should have known you'd involve yourself in matters beyond your understanding. My understanding is quite adequate, Mr. Blackwood. Boone held up a telegram with official territorial seals. Especially when it comes to recognizing institutional corruption and the harm it causes to innocent people. The crowd was growing larger as word spread through Millbrook that the confrontation they'd all been expecting was finally taking place. Families who had been pressured to sell their land watched with grim satisfaction as the man who had tried to steal their property faced exposure. Blackwood's associates emerged from the territorial office, their expressions suggesting they understood that something had gone seriously wrong with their carefully planned operation. Blackwood, the taller man called urgently, we need to complete this business immediately. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Charlotte replied before Blackwood could respond. You see, gentlemen, those documents you're carrying are evidence in a territorial fraud investigation that officially began this morning. She gestured toward the crowd, where several men had positioned themselves strategically around the main street. Morrison stood near the livery stable. Henderson controlled access to the general store, and other townspeople had quietly surrounded the area to prevent anyone from leaving unexpectedly. You're bluffing, Blackwood snarled, but uncertainty was creeping into his voice. There's no official investigation. You're a schoolteacher with delusions of importance. The sound of approaching horses provided Charlotte's answer. A group of riders crested the hill, leading into Millbrook. Legitimate territorial officials, escorted by Jonathan Whitmore himself, arriving exactly as Charlotte had planned. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, she said with satisfaction, I'm a schoolteacher whose father happens to be a respected territorial businessman with connections to people who take fraud very seriously. Blackwood's face went white as he recognized Jonathan Whitmore among the approaching riders. The man he'd been deceiving for months was arriving with territorial marshals and legal authority to investigate every document, every land transfer, every fraudulent transaction. You have no idea what you've done, Blackwood whispered, his voice carrying a menace that made several townspeople step closer to Charlotte. There are interests involved here that extend far beyond this pathetic frontier town. Then those interests will have to answer to legitimate territorial authorities, Boone replied, moving to stand beside Charlotte. Unless you'd prefer to explain your forged documents to the community you've been trying to defraud. The approaching officials were close enough now that their badges and credentials were visible. Blackwood's associates began backing toward their horses, obviously considering flight as their best option. I wouldn't recommend leaving, Morrison called from his position near the livery stable. The roads out of town are being watched, and the territorial marshal tends to take a dim view of people who flee investigation. The bronze bell continued to toll in the morning air, its clear voice announcing that Millbrook had found the courage to stand up for itself. Charlotte looked around at the faces of the community she'd come to serve, people who had learned that education meant more than reading and writing, that knowledge could be a weapon against injustice, and that ordinary citizens could successfully resist exploitation when they stood together. Blackwood made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Miss Whitmore, your father sent you here to assess educational opportunities, not to interfere with legitimate territorial development. My father sent me here to serve this community's best interests." Charlotte replied firmly, "And I've learned that sometimes serving a community's best interests means protecting them from people who would exploit their trust." The territorial marshal dismounted and approached with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex fraud cases. Behind him, Jonathan Whitmore's expression was grim but proud as he watched his daughter face down the man who had tried to use her as an unwitting accomplice. "Miss Whitmore," the marshal called, "I understand you have evidence regarding fraudulent land transactions in this territory." Charlotte held up her portfolio with the confidence of someone who had spent days organizing evidence for exactly this moment. "Marshal, I have documented proof of systematic document forgery, witness testimony regarding intimidation campaigns, and financial records that reveal the scope of the fraud scheme." As she began presenting the evidence to legitimate authorities, Charlotte realized that her educational mission in Millbrook had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. She had taught a community to value knowledge, to stand up for justice, and to refuse to accept exploitation as inevitable. The bronze bell's voice carried across the prairie, announcing that education and courage had triumphed over ignorance and corruption. And in that clear, resonant sound, Charlotte heard the promise of a future where communities like Millbrook would never again be vulnerable to those who sought to profit from their trust. The surrender document that Thomas Blackwood signed bore the territorial seal and the signatures of 3 witnesses, officially ending his attempt to defraud Millbrook's landowners and establishing a legal precedent that would protect frontier communities throughout the territory. Charlotte watched as the man who had nearly destroyed her community put his name to a confession that detailed every aspect of his fraud scheme. "Mr. Blackwood," the territorial marshal said as he witnessed the signature, "you understand that this document constitutes a full confession to charges of document forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and intimidation of territorial citizens." Blackwood's hand trembled slightly as he set down the pen. His associates had already signed their own confessions, choosing cooperation over the alternative of facing trial in the territorial capital, with evidence that would ensure lengthy prison sentences. "I understand," Blackwood replied, his voice barely audible. The confident businessman who had tried to steal half of Millbrook had been reduced to a broken man, facing the consequences of his actions. Charlotte stood with her father and Boone, watching justice finally served for the community that had trusted her to protect their interests. Jonathan Whitmore had expressed his pride in his daughter's courage and his horror at how Blackwood had manipulated him into unwitting participation in the fraud scheme. "Charlotte," her father said quietly, "when I sent you here to assess educational opportunities, I never imagined you'd uncover corruption of this magnitude." "Neither did I, Father. I thought my greatest challenge would be convincing parents that their children needed formal schooling." Boone stepped forward, his expression reflecting the mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that followed any hard-won victory. "Mr. Whitmore, your daughter has taught this community that education means more than reading and arithmetic. She's shown them that knowledge can be a defense against those who would exploit their trust." The marshal finished securing the signed confessions and turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness Blackwood's defeat. "Citizens of Millbrook, these documents ensure that all fraudulent land transfers are null and void." Your property rights are restored, and territorial authorities will implement new procedures to prevent similar schemes in the future. A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople, families who had thought they were losing their homes, children who would grow up secure in their community. Ordinary people who had learned they possessed the power to defend themselves against corruption. Henderson stepped forward, speaking for the community. "Marshal, we want you to know that none of this would have been possible without Miss Whitmore's courage and Mr. Carver's strategic thinking. They showed us how to stand up for ourselves." Mrs. Patterson nodded emphatically. "Miss Whitmore came here to teach our children, and she ended up teaching all of us that we don't have to accept injustice just because it comes with official-looking documents." Morrison, his transformation from Blackwood's accomplice to community protector complete, addressed Charlotte directly. "Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll accept my apology for the intimidation I was hired to conduct, and I hope you'll continue your school here in Millbrook." Charlotte looked around at the faces of people who had become far more than students or community members. They had become partners in proving that education could serve justice and that ordinary citizens could successfully resist powerful interests when they worked together. "Mr. Morrison, your apology is accepted, and your help in exposing Blackwood's scheme was essential to our success." She paused, considering the future that stretched ahead of them. "As for the school, I believe Millbrook has demonstrated that it values education and understands its importance." The territorial marshal prepared to depart with his prisoners, but before leaving, he had one final matter to address. "Miss Whitmore, territorial authorities would like to offer you a position as educational coordinator for frontier communities throughout this region. Your experience in organizing citizen resistance to fraud would be valuable in other areas where similar schemes might be attempted." The offer represented recognition that Charlotte's mission in Millbrook had implications extending far beyond one frontier town. Her methods for combining education with community organization could serve other vulnerable populations facing exploitation. "Marshal, I'm honored by the offer, but I believe my place is here in Millbrook, at least for now. This community has invested considerable effort in establishing a school, and I want to see that investment fulfilled." Boone smiled at her response, understanding that Charlotte had found her true calling not in teaching individual students, but in serving entire communities that needed to understand their power to resist injustice. As the Marshal's party departed with their prisoners, Millbrook settled into a celebration that reflected both relief and newfound confidence. The bronze school bell rang again, this time calling people to a community gathering where they would discuss their future now that the threat of land fraud had been eliminated. "Charlotte," Boone said as they walked toward the celebration, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've shown that education can be a form of community defense." "We've accomplished something remarkable," she corrected. "Your willingness to risk exposure, your strategic thinking, your understanding of how corruption operates, none of this would have succeeded without your participation." Jonathan Whitmore joined them as they approached the community gathering. "Charlotte, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled this situation. When I sent you here, I expected you to start a small frontier school. Instead, you've created a model for how education can serve community empowerment." The celebration that followed would be remembered in Millbrook for generations, not just as the day they defeated Thomas Blackwood's fraud scheme, but as the day they discovered their own strength as a community. Children who had been protected during the confrontation returned to find their homes secure and their futures bright with educational opportunities. As evening approached, Charlotte found herself standing with Boone beside the bronze bell that had announced their victory. The clear metal surface reflected the last rays of sunlight, and its voice had become the symbol of Millbrook's transformation from a vulnerable frontier settlement to a community capable of defending itself. "What happens now?" Boone asked. "Your original mission here is complete, and you've exceeded everyone's expectations." Charlotte considered the question seriously. The territorial marshal's offer represented an opportunity to extend their success to other communities. Her father's support meant she could establish schools throughout the region with adequate funding and official backing. But Millbrook had become more than an assignment. It had become home. "Now we build the school we always intended to build," she said finally. "We teach children not just reading and arithmetic, but critical thinking and civic responsibility. We show them that education is a tool for creating justice, not just individual advancement. And we make sure that what happened here serves as an example for other communities facing similar threats." Boone added, "The methods we developed, community organization, careful documentation, strategic cooperation with legitimate authorities, those can be taught and replicated." Charlotte nodded, understanding that their victory in Millbrook represented the beginning of something larger rather than the end of their mission. They had proven that ordinary people could successfully resist sophisticated corruption when they possessed the knowledge and organization necessary to defend themselves. The bronze bell caught the last light of day, its surface gleaming with the promise of lessons yet to be taught and communities yet to be served. Millbrook was safe, its children's futures secure, and its citizens empowered with the knowledge that they possessed the strength to protect what they valued most. The surrender document that Thomas Blackwood signed bore the territorial seal and the signatures of 3 witnesses, officially ending his attempt to defraud Millbrook's landowners and establishing a legal precedent that would protect frontier communities throughout the territory. Charlotte watched as the man who had nearly destroyed her community put his name to a confession that detailed every aspect of his fraud scheme. "Mr. Blackwood," the territorial marshal said as he witnessed the signature, "you understand that this document constitutes a full confession to charges of document forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and intimidation of territorial citizens." Blackwood's hand trembled slightly as he set down the pen. His associates had already signed their own confessions, choosing cooperation over the alternative of facing trial in the territorial capital, with evidence that would ensure lengthy prison sentences. "I understand," Blackwood replied, his voice barely audible. The confident businessman who had tried to steal half of Millbrook had been reduced to a broken man, facing the consequences of his actions. Charlotte stood with her father and Boone, watching justice finally served for the community that had trusted her to protect their interests. Jonathan Whitmore had expressed his pride in his daughter's courage and his horror at how Blackwood had manipulated him into unwitting participation in the fraud scheme. "Charlotte," her father said quietly, "when I sent you here to assess educational opportunities, I never imagined you'd uncover corruption of this magnitude." "Neither did I, Father. I thought my greatest challenge would be convincing parents that their children needed formal schooling." Boone stepped forward, his expression reflecting the mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that followed any hard-won victory. "Mr. Whitmore, your daughter has taught this community that education means more than reading and arithmetic. She's shown them that knowledge can be a defense against those who would exploit their trust." The marshal finished securing the signed confessions and turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness Blackwood's defeat. "Citizens of Millbrook, these documents ensure that all fraudulent land transfers are null and void. Your property rights are restored, and territorial authorities will implement new procedures to prevent similar schemes in the future." A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople families who had thought they were losing their homes, children who would grow up secure in their community, ordinary people who had learned they possessed the power to defend themselves against corruption. Henderson stepped forward, speaking for the community. "Marshal, we want you to know that none of this would have been possible without Miss Whitmore's courage and Mr. Carver's strategic thinking. They showed us how to stand up for ourselves." Mrs. Patterson nodded emphatically. "Miss Whitmore came here to teach our children, and she ended up teaching all of us that we don't have to accept injustice just because it comes with official-looking documents." Morrison, his transformation from Blackwood's accomplice to community protector complete, addressed Charlotte directly. "Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll accept my apology for the intimidation I was hired to conduct, and I hope you'll continue your school here in Millbrook." Charlotte looked around at the faces of people who had become far more than students or community members. They had become partners in proving that education could serve justice and that ordinary citizens could successfully resist powerful interests when they worked together. "Mr. Morrison, your apology is accepted, and your help in exposing Blackwood's scheme was essential to our success." She paused, considering the future that stretched ahead of them. "As for the school, I believe Millbrook has demonstrated that it values education and understands its importance." The territorial marshal prepared to depart with his prisoners, but before leaving, he had one final matter to address. "Miss Whitmore, territorial authorities would like to offer you a position as educational coordinator for frontier communities throughout this region. Your experience in organizing citizen resistance to fraud would be valuable in other areas where similar schemes might be attempted." The offer represented recognition that Charlotte's mission in Millbrook had implications extending far beyond one frontier town. Her methods for combining education with community organization could serve other vulnerable populations facing exploitation. "Marshal, I'm honored by the offer, but I believe my place is here in Millbrook, at least for now. This community has invested considerable effort in establishing a school, and I want to see that investment fulfilled." Boone smiled at her response, understanding that Charlotte had found her true calling not in teaching individual students, but in serving entire communities that needed to understand their power to resist injustice. As the Marshal's party departed with their prisoners, Millbrook settled into a celebration that reflected both relief and newfound confidence. The bronze school bell rang again, this time calling people to a community gathering where they would discuss their future now that the threat of land fraud had been eliminated. "Charlotte," Boone said as they walked toward the celebration, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've shown that education can be a form of community defense." "We've accomplished something remarkable," she corrected. "Your willingness to risk exposure, your strategic thinking, your understanding of how corruption operates, none of this would have succeeded without your participation." Jonathan Whitmore joined them as they approached the community gathering. "Charlotte, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled this situation. When I sent you here, I expected you to start a small frontier school. Instead, you've created a model for how education can serve community empowerment." The celebration that followed would be remembered in Millbrook for generations, not just as the day they defeated Thomas Blackwood's fraud scheme, but as the day they discovered their own strength as a community. Children who had been protected during the confrontation returned to find their homes secure and their futures bright with educational opportunities. As evening approached, Charlotte found herself standing with Boone beside the bronze bell that had announced their victory. The clear metal surface reflected the last rays of sunlight, and its voice had become the symbol of Millbrook's transformation from a vulnerable frontier settlement to a community capable of defending itself. "What happens now?" Boone asked. "Your original mission here is complete, and you've exceeded everyone's expectations." Charlotte considered the question seriously. The territorial marshal's offer represented an opportunity to extend their success to other communities. Her father's support meant she could establish schools throughout the region with adequate funding and official backing. But Millbrook had become more than an assignment. It had become home. "Now we build the school we always intended to build," she said finally. "We teach children not just reading and arithmetic, but critical thinking and civic responsibility. We show them that education is a tool for creating justice, not just individual advancement. And we make sure that what happened here serves as an example for other communities facing similar threats." Boone added, "The methods we developed, community organization, careful documentation, strategic cooperation with legitimate authorities, those can be taught and replicated. Charlotte nodded, understanding that their victory in Millbrook represented the beginning of something larger rather than the end of their mission. They had proven that ordinary people could successfully resist sophisticated corruption when they possessed the knowledge and organization necessary to defend themselves. The bronze bell caught the last light of day, its surface gleaming with the promise of lessons yet to be taught and communities yet to be served. Millbrook was safe, its children's futures secure, and its citizens empowered with the knowledge that they possessed the strength to protect what they valued most. In the gathering darkness, the bell's voice carried across the prairie one final time, announcing that education and justice had triumphed over ignorance and exploitation. And in that clear, resonant sound, Charlotte heard the promise of all the communities yet to be served, all the children yet to be taught, and all the battles yet to be won in the endless struggle between those who sought to exploit and those who chose to resist. The new school charter arrived with the spring flowers, bearing official territorial seals and signatures that established Charlotte's educational mission as a permanent institution, serving not just Millbrook, but the entire surrounding region. She held the document in her hands on a warm May morning, 6 months after her confrontation with Thomas Blackwood, and marveled at how much had changed since that first day when she'd accidentally dropped her Latin primer in the dusty street. The charter represented more than legal recognition. It symbolized a community's transformation from a collection of vulnerable homesteaders into an organized group of citizens who understood their power to shape their own destiny. The document established funding for teachers, books, and buildings, but more importantly, it codified the educational philosophy that Charlotte and Boone had developed through their struggle against corruption. "Listen to this," Charlotte said to Boone, as they stood in the doorway of their new schoolhouse, a proper building with glass windows, wooden floors, and enough space for 30 students. "The Charter states that education shall serve not merely individual advancement, but community empowerment and civic responsibility." Boone smiled as he hung the bronze bell in its permanent place above the school's front entrance. "That language will make some territorial officials uncomfortable. They prefer schools that produce compliant workers rather than critical thinkers." "Then they'll have to adjust their preferences," Charlotte replied, with the confidence of someone who had proven that communities could successfully resist powerful interests when properly organized and educated. The schoolhouse itself stood as testament to what a unified community could accomplish. Local families had contributed labor, materials, and funds according to their abilities. Henderson had donated lumber from his store at cost. Morrison had supervised construction with the same care he'd once applied to intimidating neighbors on Blackwood's behalf. Mrs. Patterson had organized the women to create furnishings and supplies. But the most significant change in Millbrook couldn't be measured in buildings or charters. It lay in the attitude of people who had learned they possessed the knowledge and organization necessary to protect what they valued most. "Miss Whitmore," young Mary Henderson called from across the schoolyard, where she was playing with classmates during their lunch break. "Will you tell us again about how communities can work together to solve problems?" Charlotte waved to her students, children whose education now included not just traditional subjects but practical lessons in civic engagement and critical thinking. They learned mathematics by analyzing local business records for irregularities. They practiced writing by corresponding with territorial officials about community needs. They studied history by examining how other communities had faced similar challenges to those that Millbrook had overcome. This afternoon we'll discuss how communities can organize to ensure that development serves local interests rather than outside exploitation, Charlotte called back. "And we'll review the letters you've been writing to your cousins in other towns about establishing their own schools." The ripple effects of Millbrook's success had spread throughout the territory as word traveled about a community that had successfully resisted a sophisticated fraud scheme. Other towns were requesting guidance on establishing educational programs that emphasized civic responsibility alongside traditional subjects. Charlotte's correspondence with teachers and community leaders had grown into an informal network of frontier educators committed to empowering their students to serve justice. Jonathan Whitmore visited regularly, bringing news from the territorial capital and supplies for the expanding school. His pride in his daughter's accomplishments was evident, but more significant was his understanding that her mission represented something larger than individual success. "Charlotte," he said during his most recent visit, "territorial authorities are asking other communities to adopt your educational model. The combination of traditional instruction with civic engagement appears to produce citizens who are better equipped to participate in democratic governance, and less susceptible to exploitation by those who prefer uninformed populations," Boone added, joining them after completing his morning classes. He had officially resumed his calling as an educator, though his teaching methods reflected hard-won understanding about the relationship between knowledge and power. The transformation in Boone himself was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Millbrook's story. The man who had hidden his true nature for 3 years behind the facade of a simple woodcutter now taught advanced mathematics and civic responsibility with the authority of someone who had learned that individual conscience could indeed overcome institutional corruption when supported by community organization. "I received a letter from the Philadelphia Seminary," Boone said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "They're requesting information about our educational methods for their social gospel curriculum." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "The same institution that forced you to choose between principle and career advancement? The same institution that has apparently learned something about the cost of protecting corrupt benefactors over vulnerable communities." Boone's expression held neither bitterness nor satisfaction, only the quiet confidence of someone who had found redemption through service. "They've established a new program for training ministers in community organization and social justice, apparently inspired by reports of our success here." The bronze bell above their heads caught the afternoon sunlight, its surface gleaming with the promise of all the lessons yet to be taught and all the communities yet to be served. Its voice had become synonymous with Millbrook's transformation, calling students to class each morning and announcing community meetings when important decisions needed to be made. As the school day ended and children scattered to their homes, Charlotte and Boone stood together in the classroom where their partnership had first developed. Maps covered the walls not just of Dakota Territory, but of the entire frontier region where their educational model was being adopted. Letters from other communities filled a growing file cabinet, testimonies to the hunger for knowledge that existed wherever people sought to control their own destinies. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't dropped that Latin primer?" Charlotte asked, straightening books on her desk and preparing for the evening's lesson planning. "I think we would have found another way to discover what we both needed to learn," Boone replied thoughtfully. "You needed to understand that education could serve justice, and I needed to remember that individual conscience gains power when it serves community needs." Their personal relationship had evolved alongside their professional partnership, marked by mutual respect and shared commitment rather than dramatic romance. They had become something rarer and more enduring than lovers. They had become partners in a mission that extended far beyond their individual lives. "The territorial marshal sent word that 3 more communities have successfully used our methods to resist questionable land deals," Charlotte said, reviewing the latest correspondence. "And 2 new schools have been established using our charter as a model. Which means we're not just teaching children in Millbrook, we're training teachers and community leaders who will carry these methods to other places that need them." As evening approached, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her from Boston society to a frontier schoolhouse where she taught lessons that extended far beyond traditional subjects. She had come to Millbrook expecting to encounter ignorance and resistance to education. Instead, she had discovered a community hungry for knowledge and capable of extraordinary courage when properly organized and informed. The bronze bell's last light of day reflected her own transformation from an idealistic young teacher into a seasoned educator who understood that knowledge without justice was incomplete and that individual wisdom without community application was insufficient to address the challenges facing frontier democracy. Millbrook's children would grow up secure in the knowledge that they possessed the tools necessary to protect their community from those who would exploit it. Other communities throughout the territory were learning similar lessons through schools modeled on Charlotte's example. And somewhere in the territorial capital, officials were beginning to understand that educated, organized communities represented the foundation of genuine democratic governance rather than a threat to established authority. The new school charter lay on Charlotte's desk beside lesson plans for the following day, plans that included traditional subjects like arithmetic and geography, but also practical instruction in document analysis, civic organization, and the rights and responsibilities of territorial citizenship. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly toward horizons that held promise rather than uncertainty. Millbrook had learned to shape its own future through education and organization, and that knowledge was spreading to every community, willing to believe that ordinary people possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to serve justice. The bronze bell caught the last rays of sunlight, its voice ready to call another generation of students to lessons that would equip them not just for individual success, but for the lifelong work of building communities worthy of their children's trust. In that promise, Charlotte heard the echo of everything she had come to Millbrook to accomplish, and the foundation of everything she would continue to build in the years ahead.